Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a massive, widespread assumption that I guarantee almost all of us have heard at some point, that giving up meat universally and automatically protects your heart. It sounds totally logical, right? But as we do here, we don't just want to rely on assumptions. We want to know what the hard data actually proves. So we're going to dive deep into a major systematic review and meta-analysis, recently published in Frontiers in Nutrition, to separate the expectations from the reality. And really, that brings us to the million-dollar mystery we are going to solve today. Can a vegetarian diet actually save your heart? We're going to look closely at what happens when you pool hundreds of thousands of real-world data points just to see if the plant-based type holds up against strict scientific scrutiny. To get to the bottom of this dense medical study, we'll follow a quick roadmap. First, we'll look at the vegetarian heart hypothesis, then hunting for the data, after that, the surprising results, next, explaining the uncertainty, and finally, we'll wrap it all up with the big takeaway. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the vegetarian heart hypothesis. Dietary guidelines all over the world, from the US to Canada to Europe, heavily recommend plant-based eating to prevent cardiovascular disease. But because these recommendations influence literally millions of lives, they require the absolute most rigorous, high-level evidence possible to back them up. So what exactly does a vegetarian diet mean for this specific study? Well, the researchers kept the parameters very precise. It's a dietary pattern that completely excludes meat, poultry, or fish. This umbrella naturally includes both lacto-ovo vegetarians, meaning folks who still eat dairy and eggs, and vegans, who exclude all animal products entirely. Now, before we get to the numbers, we gotta clear up some medical jargon. I want you to think of coronary heart disease, or CHD, as an issue with the pipes. We're talking atherosclerosis and heart attacks here. On the other hand, cardiovascular disease, or CVD, is the broader pump and system, so that encompasses overall heart failure and strokes. Keeping this whole pipes versus pump analogy in mind is going to make the data we're about to see make total sense. Moving on to Section 2, hunting for the data. So, pulling this together was basically a giant medical detective story. The researchers didn't just run one new experiment, they conducted a massive meta-analysis. They started with hundreds of records from huge databases like MEDline and Embase. Then they systematically sifted, filtered, and excluded overlapping or irrelevant data until they distilled everything down to the absolute most pristine data sets available. In the end, they were left with just 7 unique cohorts. But wow, the scale of those 7 cohorts is truly impressive. We're talking almost 200,000 participants and over 8,400 cardiovascular events, all tracked over anywhere from 5 to 21 years. This includes incredibly famous long-term studies like Epic Oxford, the Adventist Health Studies, and the Heidelberg Study. It's a huge pool of information. Which brings us to Section 3, the surprising results. Okay, we've got our definitions and we've got our massive pool of data. So what did they actually find? Well, remember our pipes versus pump analogy? The findings are completely split depending on exactly which part of the cardiovascular system we're looking at. For the pipes, coronary heart disease, the data showed a statistically significant 22% reduction in mortality for those following a vegetarian diet. With a risk ratio of 0.78, that means giving up meat showed a very real protective trend against fatal heart attacks. And honestly, it gets even better for the pipes. There was actually a 28% reduction in CHD incidence, with a risk ratio of 0.72. Now, incidence means actually developing the disease in the first place. So the data strongly suggests the diet isn't just preventing death from blocked arteries, it's actually associated with preventing the blockages from occurring at all. But here is where the story takes a massive turn. When we shift from the pipes to the broader system, specifically looking at stroke mortality and overall CVD mortality, the protective effect kind of vanishes. Sure, the numbers show an 8% reduction with a risk ratio of 0.92, but crucially, the statistical margin crosses the 1.0 threshold. And in statistics, crossing 1.0 means there is no definitive significant association. So when you summarize all these pooled estimates, you get this really split reality. You have these clear protective trends for coronary heart disease, but right alongside those exciting numbers, the researchers use the grade system to evaluate the certainty of the evidence. And for every single outcome across the board, they graded the evidence as very low. Let's unpack exactly why that is in Section 4, explaining the uncertainty. Yeah, so here's the catch. Despite the really positive numerical trends protecting your arteries, the strict scientific community evaluated this mountain of data and determined that we actually can't be very confident in it quite yet. We literally have exciting findings of reduced risk sitting right next to a very low certainty evaluation. GRADE is basically the gold standard that medical professionals use to rate evidence, and they had to downgrade the study for two major reasons: indirectness and imprecision. The first reason is what scientists call indirectness. Basically, up to 91% of the people in these studies weren't exactly your average everyday folks. They heavily relied on specific groups like Seventh-day Adventists, Vegetarian Society members, and health food store shoppers. Because these groups tend to live exceptionally healthy lifestyles overall, like maybe they smoke a lot less or they exercise a lot more, we just can't perfectly generalize these results to the broader public. The second reason is imprecision. Now, a lack of association for strokes doesn't mean the vegetarian diet is a failure. It just means the statistical margins in the current data are way too wide and honestly too blurry to be absolutely certain. The data simply couldn't rule out a clinically important benefit or potentially even a harm when it comes to the broader cardiovascular pump and system. All right, let's wrap this all up in Section 5, the big takeaway. So with highly promising trends for your arteries, but very cautious scientific certainty, how do we bring this impartial data back to your daily life? Like, what is actually happening biologically when you skip the meat? Well, giving it up intrinsically alters your biochemistry. Vegetarian diets are naturally higher in fiber and phytochemicals, and crucially, they are much lower in saturated fat. That directly lowers the bad LDL cholesterol that clogs up those pipes. You also consume less heme iron and produce less of a gut metabolite called TMAO, and both of those things are heavily linked to cardiovascular events. The researchers summed up the current state of the science perfectly, noting that more research, particularly in different populations, is needed to improve the certainty in our estimates. The observational data we have right now is incredibly promising for protecting your coronary arteries, for sure. But the scientific jury is demanding high-quality, randomized controlled trials before they can declare it an absolute universal fact. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. The plant-based movement is undeniably surging right now for both personal and planetary health. But as we've seen today, the line between what we expect to happen and what the hard data actually proves with certainty is super complex. As we wait for the next generation of rigorous nutritional science to come out, what do you think it will reveal about the food on your plate? Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.